You are not exhausted because life is difficult. You are exhausted because you believe it is against you. Every setback feels personal. Every delay feels like rejection. Every obstacle feels like proof that something is wrong with your path. But nothing in life carries meaning until your mind assigns it. The weight you feel is not in the event, it is in your judgment of the event. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and you have the power to revoke that estimate at any moment. Most people never use that power. They react. They assume. They suffer twice, once from what happened, and once from the story they tell about it, and that is where their energy is lost. You do not see the world as it is. You see the world as your mind has been trained to see it. And most of that training happened long before you were aware of it, through past experiences, through quiet fears, through beliefs you never questioned. So when you step into any situation, you are not meeting reality directly. You are meeting your interpretation of it. And then you call that interpretation the truth. This is where most people lose clarity without realizing it, because they assume what they feel is objective. But it is not. It is filtered, shaped, and often distorted. Two people can walk into the same room and leave with completely different experiences. One sees opportunity, the other sees threat. One feels welcomed, the other feels judged. The environment did not change. Only the lens did, and that lens is built from everything you carry inside. If your mind holds tension, you will find tension. If your mind holds doubt, you will find reasons to doubt. Not because the world is designed that way, but because your attention is guided that way. Your mind highlights what it already believes, and quietly ignores what contradicts it. I began to notice this in small moments. Moments that seemed insignificant at first. A simple conversation, a look from someone, a delayed reply, and I would immediately assign meaning to it. I would assume disinterest, disrespect, or distance. And each time I reacted to that assumption as if it were real. But later, when I looked again with more distance, I saw something uncomfortable. The situation itself had been neutral. It was my interpretation that created the weight, and that realization changes something fundamental, because it shifts responsibility back to where it belongs, not on the world, but on your perception of it. Epictetus made this distinction clear. It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. And this is not just a philosophical idea. It is a practical observation you can test in your own life. Notice how quickly your mind labels something as good or bad, success or failure, respect or rejection. And once that label is applied, your emotions follow it without resistance. You feel what you believe, not necessarily what is real. And that is why two people can live in the same conditions and experience completely different lives. What you call reality is often a reflection of your internal state, like a mirror that does not show the world, but shows the way you are positioned in front of it. If the mirror is covered with the dust of old memories, unresolved experiences, and repeated fears, then the image you see will always be unclear. Not because the world is unclear, but because your perception is. And most people try to fix the reflection without ever cleaning the mirror. They try to change people, change situation, change outcomes, but they never question the lens through which they are seeing everything. There is a quiet discipline in stepping back from your immediate reaction and asking a simple question. What if this is not what I think it is? What if the meaning I am assigning is incomplete or even wrong? This pause creates space, and in that space you regain control. because you are no longer being pulled by automatic interpretation. You are observing it. And that is where clarity begins. Not by forcing yourself to think positively, but by refusing to accept your first judgment as absolute truth. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly. He reminded himself that everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. And this mindset does not make you passive. It makes you precise. It forces you to separate what actually happened from what you are telling yourself about what happened. And that separation is where strength begins. Because once you see that your interpretation is optional, you realize your suffering is not fixed. It is adjustable. When you begin to observe your own reactions closely, you will notice patterns, the same triggers, the same assumptions, the same emotional loops repeating in different situations. And that repetition is not coming from the outside world. It is coming from within you. The world is simply providing different surfaces for the same internal patterns to reflect on. And once you see that clearly, the focus shifts. You stop asking why this keeps happening to you, and you start asking what inside you keeps responding this way. This is not about blaming yourself. It is about reclaiming influence. Because if your experience of life is shaped by your perception, then changing that perception changes everything that follows. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily, quietly, and most importantly, sustainably. Because you are no longer trying to control the uncontrollable, you are working on the only place where real control exists. Your mind. The world will not adjust itself to match your expectations, but your perception can adjust to see the world more clearly, and when it does, something shifts. Situations that once felt heavy become manageable. Interactions that once felt threatening become neutral, and challenges that once felt personal begin to feel like they are simply part of the structure of life, not an attack against you. And that shift is where calm begins. Not from changing the world, but from understanding how you are seeing it. You can promise yourself anything. You can say you will change. You can decide that tomorrow will be different. But your life does not move according to what you say. It moves according to what you repeat. And this is where most people deceive themselves. They believe intention is enough. They believe clarity is enough. They believe that understanding their problem means they have already begun to solve it. But the deeper part of the mind does not respond to intention. It responds to evidence. And evidence is built through action. There is a quiet gap between what you say and what you do. And that gap is where your real identity is formed. Not in your thoughts, not in your plans, but in your patterns. Because the unconscious mind does not track your promises. It tracks your behavior. Every repeated action is recorded. Every avoidance is remembered. Every delay is noted. And over time, these repetitions form a map, not of who you want to be, but of who you are proving yourself to be. This is why someone can say they want discipline and still live in chaos. Because their actions are reinforcing a different story. Marcus Aurelius never relied on motivation. He relied on repetition. He wrote to himself daily, not because he lacked knowledge, but because he understood that knowledge without practice fades quickly. He reminded himself to stay aligned, to act with reason, to not be pulled by impulse. And most importantly, he understood that character is not built in moments of decision. It is built in moments of repetition, the small choices made when no one is watching, the quiet discipline that no one applauds. I began to see this in my own life, in a way that was difficult to ignore. I would set intentions at the start of the day. I would tell myself I would focus. I would tell myself I would follow through. But when the moment came, I hesitated. I delayed. I chose comfort. And then I told myself I would do better next time. But next time looked the same, and the pattern continued. And what became clear is that I was not lacking awareness. I was lacking alignment between what I said and what I did. And the longer that gap remained, the stronger the old identity became. The unconscious mind works like a silent recorder. It does not argue with you. It does not analyze your excuses. It simply observes and stores patterns. If you consistently avoid difficult tasks, it records you as someone who avoids difficulty. If you consistently follow through, even when it is uncomfortable, it records you as someone who acts despite discomfort. And over time, this recording becomes your default. Not because you chose it consciously, but because you reinforced it repeatedly. And once a pattern becomes default, it begins to guide your future decisions automatically. This is why change feels difficult, not because you are incapable, but because your past actions have built a path that your mind prefers to follow. And stepping off that path feels unnatural at first. It feels forced. It feels uncomfortable. But that discomfort is not a sign that you are wrong. It is a sign that you are interrupting a familiar pattern. And this is where most people stop. They interpret discomfort as resistance, and resistance as a reason to quit. But in reality, that moment of discomfort is the exact point where change begins. Epictetus taught that we become what we repeatedly practice. And this principle is direct. It leaves no room for illusion. If you practice avoidance, you become avoidant. If you practice courage, you become courageous. Not because you feel different, but because you act differently. And over time, those actions reshape your internal landscape. What once felt difficult becomes normal. What once felt unnatural becomes automatic. And the identity you were trying to reach begins to stabilize. A single action will not define you, but repeated actions will. One day of focus will not make you disciplined, but consistent focus will. One moment of courage will not make you brave, but repeated courage will. This is how the unconscious learns, through accumulation, through consistency, through patterns that are reinforced over time. And this is why small actions matter more than grand declarations, because small actions are repeatable, and repeatability is what builds identity. You do not need a perfect plan. You do not need the right mood. You do not need to feel ready. You need to act in alignment with the person you claim to be, even when it is inconvenient, especially when it is inconvenient, because that is when the unconscious pays the most attention. That is when the signal is strongest. That is when a new pattern begins to form, not from what you intend, but from what you actually do. And when you understand this clearly, something shifts. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop relying on motivation. You stop waiting for the right moment, because you see that the right moment is created by action, not the other way around. And from that point, change becomes simpler, not easier, but clearer, because you are no longer trying to convince yourself. You are training yourself. And training happens through repetition, not through words. You do not become who you say you are. You become what your actions prove repeatedly. Identity is not a declaration. It is a pattern. It is not built in a moment of decision. It is built in the quiet accumulation of behavior that no one else sees. And this is where most people misunderstand themselves. They believe identity comes first. Then action follows. But the truth moves in the opposite direction. Action comes first. Identity follows. And once you see this clearly, you stop waiting to feel different before you begin. Most people say they are not confident, but what they really mean is they have not acted confidently enough times for it to feel natural. Most people say they lack discipline, But what they really lack is repeated proof that they can follow through when it is uncomfortable. The mind does not grant identity based on intention. It grants identity based on evidence, and evidence is built through repetition. Every time you act in a certain way, you are casting a vote for the person you are becoming. And over time, those votes accumulate into something solid, something your mind begins to accept as true. Marcus Aurelius never told himself to feel strong. He told himself to act in accordance with reason, to do what is required, to carry out his role without complaint. And through that repeated alignment, strength was not something he searched for. It became something he embodied, not because he was free from doubt, but because he acted despite it. And this is the distinction that matters. Identity is not built in the absence of resistance. It is built through consistent action in the presence of resistance. I realized this in a way that was uncomfortable but necessary. I used to think I needed to feel ready before I acted. I believed that confidence had to come first, that clarity had to come first, that motivation had to come first. But what I saw over time is that waiting for those states kept me stuck in the same place. Because they were not causes, they were results. And results only appear after behavior changes, not before. So the longer I waited, the longer I remained the same. And the moment I began to act without waiting, something shifted. Not immediately, but steadily. The first actions felt unnatural, almost forced, like stepping outside of a familiar version of myself. There was resistance, hesitation, even doubt. But those reactions were not signs that I was doing something wrong. They were signs that I was doing something new. And new always feels unstable at first, because it has not yet been repeated enough times to become familiar. And this is where most people stop. They interpret discomfort as misalignment, when in reality it is often the first indicator of change. The mind resists what it has not yet learned to recognize as normal. Identity does not require belief to begin. It requires behavior. You do not need to believe you are disciplined in order to act with discipline. You do not need to believe you are confident in order to speak with clarity. You do not need to believe you are strong in order to endure difficulty. Belief will follow behavior, not lead it. And once behavior is repeated enough times, belief becomes unavoidable, because the mind cannot ignore consistent evidence. It adapts to it, it accepts it, and it eventually reinforces it. Epictetus made this simple. If you want to be something, act as it, not occasionally, but consistently, not when it feels easy, but especially when it feels difficult, because difficulty is what tests whether the action is real or conditional. Anyone can act in alignment when conditions are favorable, but identity is not built in favorable conditions. It is built in moments where you could choose comfort, but choose principle instead. That is where the signal is strongest. That is where the pattern begins to change. Think about how identity is formed over time, not through one decision, but through thousands of small confirmations. Each time you follow through, each time you do what you said you would do, each time you act in alignment with the standard you set for yourself, you reinforce that identity. And each time you break that alignment, you weaken it. This is not about perfection. It is about consistency, because consistency shapes perception, and perception shapes behavior, and behavior shapes identity again, creating a cycle that either strengthens or erodes who you are becoming. When you understand this, you stop asking how to feel different, and you start asking how to act differently. You stop negotiating with your emotions, and you start directing your behavior. You stop waiting for a version of yourself to appear, and you start building that version through what you do each day. And over time, What once required effort becomes automatic. What once felt unnatural becomes familiar. And what once felt like a performance becomes who you are. Identity is not something you discover. It is something you construct. Deliberately, repeatedly, and often quietly, through actions that align with the person you choose to become. And once that construction is underway, you no longer need to convince yourself of who you are. Your actions will make it clear, not just to others, but to you. And that clarity is what stabilizes change. Not motivation, not intention, but evidence, built one action at a time. Most people are not living their lives. They are performing roles they learned to survive, roles that made them acceptable, stable, and safe. But over time, those roles become so familiar that they start to feel like identity. And that is where the separation begins. Not between you and the world, but between you and yourself. Because what you are living no longer reflects what you are. It reflects what you were conditioned to be. And the longer you stay in that condition, the harder it becomes to recognize the difference. You learn early how to adapt, how to speak in ways that are approved, how to behave in ways that avoid conflict, how to choose paths that are considered secure. And none of this is wrong. Adaptation is necessary. But when adaptation becomes your entire way of living, you lose contact with your own nature. You stop asking what is true for you, and you start asking what will be accepted. And slowly, without noticing, your life becomes aligned with expectation rather than purpose. Marcus Aurelius understood this clearly. Even as an emperor, he reminded himself that he was not the role. He was the person carrying the role. He wrote to himself not to be distracted by status, not to be consumed by what others thought of him, not to confuse position with character, because he knew that roles are temporary. But the way you conduct yourself within those roles defines you. And if you forget that, you begin to live for appearance instead of substance. There is a subtle danger in living a life that looks correct from the outside, because it can prevent you from questioning whether it feels correct on the inside. You can have stability, structure, even success, and still feel a quiet emptiness that you cannot explain. Not because something is missing externally, but because something has been ignored internally, and that feeling does not come from weakness. It comes from misalignment, from living in a way that does not fully reflect who you are capable of being. I began to notice this when everything seemed to be in place. The routine was steady. The direction was clear. The outcomes were acceptable. But there was a sense that something was off. Not dramatically, not enough to disrupt anything, but enough to create a constant background tension. And when I looked closer, I realized that many of my decisions were not based on what I truly valued, but on what I believed I should value. And the difference is small in language, but significant in experience. You can follow a path that makes sense and still feel disconnected from it. You can achieve goals that are considered meaningful and still question why they feel empty. Because meaning is not determined by external validation, it is determined by internal alignment. And when those two do not match, no amount of progress will feel satisfying. You will continue moving forward while feeling like you are not actually moving anywhere. Seneca warned about this in a direct way. He said that many people spend their lives doing what others expect and call that living, when in reality they are simply following a script that was handed to them. And the cost of that script is not always visible immediately. It accumulates over time, in the form of restlessness, dissatisfaction, and a quiet sense that you are not fully present in your own life. Breaking out of that pattern does not require a dramatic change. It requires awareness, the willingness to question what you have been repeating without thought. The courage to notice where your actions are driven by fear of judgment rather than clarity of purpose, and the discipline to begin making small adjustments, not to reject responsibility, not to abandon structure, but to realign your actions with something that is actually yours, not something you inherited without question. This is where most people hesitate, because stepping away from a role that has provided stability feels uncertain. It removes the certainty of approval. It introduces the possibility of being misunderstood. And for many, that is enough to remain where they are. But remaining in misalignment carries its own cost. A cost that is paid slowly, over time, through a life that feels controlled but not fully lived. And that trade is rarely worth it when seen clearly. You do not need to abandon everything to correct this. You need to become more precise about why you are doing what you are doing. You need to separate what is necessary from what is habitual, what is chosen from what is inherited. And once you begin to see that distinction, you regain something that most people lose without realizing it: authorship over your own life. Not complete control, but clear participation. Not perfection, but alignment. Living without awareness turns life into performance. Living with awareness turns life into practice. And the difference between those two is not visible to others. But it is undeniable to you, because one feels like you are maintaining an image, and the other feels like you are building something real, something that holds even when no one is watching, something that does not depend on approval to exist. You are not the role you are playing. You are the one choosing how to play it. And that choice, repeated over time, is what determines whether your life reflects who you are or hides it. You are waiting to be certain before you begin. And that is why you remain where you are. Not because you lack ability, not because the path is closed, but because you are demanding clarity that life does not provide in advance. You want to see the entire road before taking the first step. You want guarantees before movement. You want certainty before commitment. But life does not reveal itself that way. It reveals itself in response to action, not before it. Most people do not admit this directly. They say they are preparing. They say they are thinking it through. They say they are waiting for the right time. But beneath all of that is the same pattern. Hesitation disguised as caution. Delay disguised as strategy. And over time, that pattern becomes familiar. It feels reasonable. It feels safe. But it also keeps them in the same place, repeating the same thoughts, imagining different outcomes without ever creating them. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you should not disturb yourself by imagining the whole of your life at once. You will meet the future with the same reason you use now. And this is not a comforting idea. It is a precise one. It removes the illusion that you need to solve everything before you begin. It brings your attention back to what is available, the present moment, the next decision, the immediate action that is within your control. And when you reduce your focus to that level, something shifts. The task becomes clear, not easy, but clear. I resisted this for longer than I expected. I believed that if I could just think long enough, plan carefully enough, analyze deeply enough, I would eventually reach a point where action felt obvious. But that point never came, because thinking without action does not produce clarity. It produces more thinking. And the more I waited, the more complicated everything seemed. Not because the situation changed, but because my mind kept expanding the possibilities without testing any of them. There was a moment when I stopped trying to resolve everything mentally and decided to act on something small, something incomplete, something that did not feel fully prepared. And the result was not immediate success. It was something more useful. Feedback. Reality responded. Not perfectly, not predictably, but enough to show me what the next step should be. And that is when I understood something that had been obvious but ignored. Clarity is not a prerequisite for action. It is a result of action. Life functions in sequences, not in complete pictures. You are not meant to see the entire structure at once. You are meant to move through it step by step. And each step reveals information that was not available before, not because it was hidden, but because your perspective had not reached the point where you could see it. This is why standing still feels confusing. Because you are trying to understand something that can only be understood through movement. Epictetus emphasized that we should focus only on what is within our control. And what is within your control is never the entire path. It is always the next action, the next choice, the next response. And when you direct your attention there, you remove the weight of everything else. You are no longer responsible for the outcome of the entire journey. You are responsible for the quality of your next step. And that is a burden you can carry. There is a tendency to overestimate the importance of the first move, as if it must be perfect, as if it determines everything that follows. But the first move is rarely decisive. What matters is that it exists, because without it, nothing else can follow. Movement creates momentum, and momentum simplifies decisions. Once you are in motion, the distance between choices shortens. Feedback becomes immediate. Adjustments become natural, and what once felt overwhelming begins to feel structured. Waiting for certainty is an attempt to control what cannot be controlled. You are trying to eliminate risk before you act. But risk is part of the process, not a condition you can remove. And avoiding it does not make you safer. It makes you stagnant, and stagnation has its own consequences. It keeps you in a state where nothing improves, nothing changes, and over time that becomes more damaging than any mistake you were trying to avoid. You do not need to be ready. Readiness is not a fixed state. It is something that develops through engagement. The more you act, the more capable you become. The more capable you become, the less uncertain things feel. And this progression cannot be reversed. You cannot think your way into readiness. You can only act your way into it. And once you accept that, the barrier that seemed so solid begins to lose its structure. The path does not appear for those who wait. It appears for those who move. Not all at once, not completely, but enough to continue. And that is all you need. Not the entire answer. Just the next step taken with clarity and intention. And when you operate this way consistently, something changes in how you experience life. It becomes less about predicting the future and more about participating in it. Less about avoiding mistakes and more about learning from them. Less about control and more about direction. You are not stuck because the path is unclear. You are stuck because you are trying to see before you are willing to move. And once you reverse that, once you act before you fully understand, the structure of your experience begins to reorganize, not into certainty, but into progress. And progress is what creates clarity over time. You cannot control what happens. You cannot control what people say. You cannot control how events unfold. And yet most of your suffering comes from trying to do exactly that. From resisting what is already outside your reach. From arguing with reality as if it should obey your expectations. And this is where your energy is lost. Not in the event itself, but in your refusal to accept the limits of your control. Because once you try to control everything, you end up controlling nothing, including yourself. The Stoics were precise about this. They divided life into two categories: what is within your control and what is not. And everything that disturbs you can be traced back to confusing these two. Do you try to control opinions, outcomes, timing, recognition. And when those do not align with your preference, you feel frustration, anger, disappointment, not because life is unfair, but because your expectations were placed in the wrong direction. And the more you invest your peace in what you cannot control, the more unstable your experience becomes. Marcus Aurelius repeated this to himself constantly. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. This is not a comforting statement. It is a demanding one, because it removes excuses. It removes the idea that your state depends on circumstances, and it places responsibility exactly where most people avoid it, on how you choose to respond. Moment by moment, without exception, I began to understand this in situations where my first reaction felt justified. Someone said something careless. A plan did not go as expected. Something I invested in did not return what I thought it would. And the immediate response was irritation, the sense that something wrong had been done to me. But when I paused, even briefly, and questioned that reaction, I saw something different. The event had already happened. My reaction was adding a second layer of disturbance. One that I was creating myself. And that second layer was optional. There is always a space between what happens and how you respond, and that space is where control exists. Not control over the event, but control over yourself. And most people collapse that space. They react immediately. They allow impulse to dictate behavior, and then they justify that reaction as natural, as inevitable. But it is neither. It is practiced, repeated, reinforced over time, and like any pattern, it can be changed, but only if it is observed first. Epictetus taught that when something happens, the first thing you should say to yourself is, "This is an impression, not the thing itself." And that distinction creates distance. It slows the automatic process of reaction. It gives you a moment to examine what you are about to do. And in that moment, you can choose differently, not based on impulse, but based on principle, not based on emotion, but based on reason. And that choice, repeated consistently, becomes a form of internal stability that external events cannot easily disturb. Controlling yourself does not mean suppressing emotion. It means directing it. It means recognizing that anger, frustration, or fear may arise, but they do not have to decide your behavior. They are signals, not commands. And once you see them that way, you are no longer controlled by them. You are informed by them. And there is a difference between those two states that becomes clear only through practice. Seneca warned that the greatest loss is not external, but the loss of self-control, because once you lose control of your response, everything else follows. Your decisions become reactive. Your actions become inconsistent, and your sense of direction weakens, not because the path is unclear, but because your internal state is unstable, and stability does not come from controlling the world. It comes from controlling how you meet it. This control is not dramatic. It does not appear as a sudden transformation. It appears in small moments, choosing not to respond immediately, choosing to listen instead of react, choosing to focus on what can be done instead of what cannot be changed. And these moments are easy to overlook, but they accumulate, and over time they reshape how you operate. They create a pattern of response that is deliberate rather than automatic. And that pattern becomes your strength. When you shift your attention from what you cannot control to what you can, your experience simplifies. Not because life becomes easier, but because your focus becomes precise. You stop wasting energy on resistance. You stop expecting the world to align with you. and you begin aligning yourself with what is actually happening. And in that alignment, there is a form of calm that is not dependent on outcome, but on clarity. You will still face difficulty. You will still encounter uncertainty. You will still deal with people and situations that do not meet your expectations. But those things no longer determine your state, because your state is grounded in something more stable, your ability to choose your response. And that ability, once developed, becomes the foundation of everything else, because it is the one area where your influence is absolute. If you are willing to exercise it, you are not powerless. But your power is not where you have been looking. It is not in controlling events. It is in controlling yourself. And once you accept that fully, not as an idea, but as a practice, your relationship with life changes. Not because life has changed, but because you have. And that change is what allows you to move through difficulty without being defined by it. Life is not designed to oppose you. It is designed to test you. And the moment you understand this, the way you interpret difficulty begins to change. Not because the difficulty disappears, but because its meaning shifts. Most people move through life as if every obstacle is a mistake, as if every setback is a sign they are on the wrong path. But that assumption weakens them. It turns every challenge into resistance, and resistance into exhaustion. And over time they begin to see life as something to endure rather than something to engage with. The Stoics saw this differently. They did not ask for an easier life. They asked to become stronger within it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the obstacle is not in the way. The obstacle is the way, meaning that what stands in front of you is not separate from your path. It is your path. And if you treat it as something to avoid, you avoid growth. But if you treat it as something to work through, you build capacity. Not in theory, but in practice. I used to ask the wrong question. Why is this happening to me? And every time I asked it, he felt smaller, more restricted, more controlled by circumstances, because that question assumes that something unfair has occurred. It places you in a passive position, waiting for things to change. But when I changed the question to what is this asking from me, something shifted. The situation remained the same, but my role in it changed. I was no longer a victim of the event. I became a participant within it. This shift is subtle, but it is decisive, because it moves your focus from complaint to response, from resistance to engagement. And that is where strength begins. Not in avoiding difficulty, but in using it. Every challenge contains a demand. Sometimes it demands patience. Sometimes discipline. Sometimes clarity. Sometimes restraint. And if you meet that demand, you leave the situation with something you did not have before. Not because the situation gave it to you, but because it required it from you. Epictetus taught that circumstances do not make the person, they reveal the person. And if that is true, then every difficulty is a form of exposure. It shows you where you are strong, where you are weak, where you are reactive, where you are stable. And this information is valuable, but only if you are willing to see it without defense, without excuse, without distortion. Because once you see clearly, you can adjust. And adjustment is what leads to growth. Most people try to escape discomfort as quickly as possible. They look for distraction, for relief, for ways to avoid the pressure. But in doing so, they avoid the very condition that would strengthen them. Because pressure is not only something that breaks you, it is something that shapes you, depending on how you respond to it. And if you always move away from it, you remain untested. And what remains untested remains weak, not by definition, but by lack of use. Seneca made this clear. He said that difficulty strengthens the mind as labor strengthens the body. And this is not a metaphor, it is a process. When you face something that requires effort and you stay with it instead of withdrawing, you build capacity, not immediately, but gradually, and that capacity becomes part of you. It changes how you approach future situations. It reduces hesitation. It increases stability. And it creates a form of confidence that is not based on success, but on experience. There is no version of life where you are free from challenge. But there is a version of you that can meet challenge without being overwhelmed by it. And that version is not given. It is built through repeated exposure, through deliberate response, through choosing to engage instead of retreat. And this does not require extreme conditions. It begins in small moments. Choosing to remain composed when you could react. Choosing to continue when you could stop. Choosing to face what you would rather avoid. And each of those choices adds something to your internal structure. When you start to see life this way, difficulty no longer feels like an interruption. It feels like part of the design, not something placed against you, but something placed for you, not to harm you, but to refine you. And this perspective does not remove pain, but it removes unnecessary suffering. Because you are no longer fighting the existence of the challenge, you are working with it. And that cooperation changes the entire experience. You will still feel pressure. You will still feel resistance. You will still encounter moments where things do not go as planned. But those moments no longer define your direction. They become part of your development. And over time, what once felt like a burden begins to feel like training. Not because it is easy, but because it is purposeful. And purpose changes how weight is carried. It does not make it lighter, but it makes it meaningful. Life is not your enemy. It is your training ground. And every situation you face is asking something from you. Not asking for perfection, but asking for participation, asking for effort, asking for awareness. And when you respond to that consistently, you become someone who is not dependent on ideal conditions to function. Someone who can move forward regardless of what appears. And that is where freedom begins. Not in controlling life, but in becoming capable within it.